Not every tragedy begins with tears. Some tragedies begin with laughter. That laughter echoed through a vast courtroom, a place meant only for silence and solemnity. It wasn't loud, not raucous, but sharp, like a thin blade, enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who heard it. It was the laughter of Keith Simmons. He sat casually in a gleaming leather chair dressed in a suit worth several $1,000s, every stitch so perfect there wasn't a single wrinkle. On his wrist was an expensive vintage watch, not merely to tell time, but to remind the world that he belonged to a different class. Keith leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something, then laughed again. A laugh filled with contempt. His gaze swept across the courtroom and stopped at the empty chair beside the woman who had once been his wife. No lawyer, no files. No one was standing next to her. Only Grace. She sat there, looking far smaller than the space around her. The simple gray dress she wore had been with her for years. Not new, not old, just neat enough not to draw attention. Her hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles pale, as if letting go for even a second would cause everything to collapse. Grace did not look at Keith. She stared straight ahead, at the judge's chair, still empty. No one knew what she was thinking. No one knew whether fear, despair, or quiet acceptance filled her heart. Keith thought he knew. He thought, she's finished. In Keith's mind, this trial had ended long ago, before it even began. It ended the moment he froze every joint account. It ended when Grace lost access to money, credit cards, or anything that might allow her to defend herself. It ended when he was certain that no respectable lawyer would take on a client with no money. Keith leaned back in his chair and slowly adjusted his cuff, as if waiting for dessert after dinner. To him, this was not a trial. It was a performance. And Grace, the woman who had shared 5 years of her life with him, was nothing more than a supporting character in his victory play. "She's late," Keith murmured to his lawyer, quietly enough to appear polite, but loudly enough for Grace to hear. Or maybe she's finally realized that giving up is cheaper. Keith's lawyer didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth curled slightly upward. It was the smile of someone accustomed to winning. No need for joy, because victory was already assured. In legal circles, that man was considered a weapon. He didn't just win divorce cases. He crushed the opposition, leaving nothing behind but ashes and a signature on an agreement entirely in his favor. Keith liked that. He liked the feeling of holding life and death in his hands. He liked watching others feel helpless. He glanced at Grace again, this time without hiding his mockery. "Look at her," Keith sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Pathetic. Like a deer standing in the middle of a highway waiting for a truck to slam into it." A few people seated behind them shifted slightly, not out of curiosity, but discomfort. Still, no one spoke. In this courtroom, Keith Simmons had money, power, and a lawyer. Grace was just a woman sitting alone. No one defends the weak when the powerful are laughing. A side door opened. The court officer's deep voice rang out. "All rise!" The judge entered. The atmosphere changed. Keith's laughter vanished, instantly replaced by a carefully rehearsed expression of seriousness. He stood, straightened his jacket, and bowed his head just enough, a flawless gesture of courtesy, like everything else in his life. The judge looked down at both tables. His eyes paused on Grace's side. His hand hesitated slightly over the file. "Mrs. Simmons," he said evenly, coldly, "I see you are not accompanied by legal counsel." Grace rose slowly. Her throat was dry. "Your Honor, I am. My lawyer is on the way." Just those last 3 words alone cost her all the strength she had left. Keith laughed, not loudly, but deliberately, just enough to break the solemnity, just enough to humiliate. "Perhaps her lawyer is stuck in traffic," Keith said mockingly. "Or maybe the check didn't clear." He leaned toward Grace, his eyes cold as steel. "Oh, right. I forgot. You don't have an account to write checks from anymore." Another stab, public, unconcealed. The judge struck the gavel in warning, but Keith had already gotten what he wanted. He saw Grace swallow hard, saw her shoulders tremble slightly. To Keith, that was victory. At that moment, he believed he had reached the absolute pinnacle of power, that the woman before him was nothing more than a shadow. No money, no voice, no escape. Keith didn't know, or somewhat, he had forgotten something fatal. He forgot that Grace was not just a silent wife. He forgot that some pasts do not disappear simply because we refuse to speak of them. And he forgot that some doors do not open to save the weak. They are open to punishing the arrogant. In just a few minutes, the door at the back of the courtroom would open, and when it did, the laughter of Keith Simmons would be the first thing to disappear. The trial did not begin with the strike of a gavel, but with a heavy feeling slowly spreading through the air. It was the feeling that everything had already been arranged, that the outcome seemed to have been written in advance, and that what followed was merely a formality to legitimize a victory. Keith Simmons felt it clearly. He sat up straighter, both hands resting lightly on the dark wooden table, his long fingers tapping in their own rhythm, the rhythm of absolute confidence. To Keith, this was not a place of judgment. This was a stage, and he had paid a great deal of money to ensure that he was the only one standing under the spotlight. Keith's lawyer rose to his feet, his voice deep and steady, not loud but strong enough to fill the entire courtroom. Every word was chosen carefully, sharp as a surgeon's blade. He spoke of the efficient use of the court's time, of the prolonged lack of preparation by the defendant, of the fact that Mrs. Grace Simmons currently has no valid legal representation. Each sentence fell like a stone, piling one upon another, forming a tall, cold wall in front of Grace. Grace stood still, her hands folded in front of her abdomen, her eyes lowered to the floor. Not out of shame, but because she was trying to keep her breathing from breaking apart. In her mind, everything moved more slowly than usual. Sounds echoed as if from far away. Her name, Keith's name, complex legal terms, all of it blended into a current she struggled just to remain standing in. She knew she was being judged, not only by the judge, but by the entire room. The woman without a lawyer. The wife is without money. The one about to lose. Grace felt the glances brushing past her. Some curious, some sympathetic, but most were indifferent. To them, this was just another divorce among hundreds they had seen. A wealthy man, a woman who stayed home and pursued art, a familiar script. Keith knew it, and he enjoyed it. He leaned forward and requested permission to speak. His voice was low, carefully calibrated to sound reasonable, trustworthy. "Your Honor," Keith said, "I only want to make sure that everything proceeds fairly." The word fair echoed like a bitter joke. Keith continued, his eyes flicking briefly toward Grace before returning to the judge. "My wife, Mrs. Grace, is a rather sensitive person. She is not accustomed to complex financial and legal matters. Throughout our marriage, I was the one who handled everything, from investments and assets to financial obligations." He paused, as if weighing his words, then let out a dramatic sigh. "Perhaps that is why she seems a bit confused today. I offered a very generous settlement, a sum of money sufficient for her to start over along with a car, but she refused." Keith turned to look at Grace, His gaze was no longer cold, but tinged with feigned pity. "I tried to help you, Grace." The courtroom fell silent. Grace lifted her head. In that brief moment, her eyes met Keith's. There was no explosive anger that Keith had expected, no tears, only a profound exhaustion, the kind that comes from having explained oneself too many times to people who refuse to listen. She wanted to say that it wasn't generosity. She wanted to say that money could not compensate for years of control. She wanted to say that she refused to play games, but it was the final boundary of her self-respect. But Grace said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that in this moment, no one was listening. Keith's lawyer seized the opportunity immediately. He cited legal precedents and urged the court to proceed with the hearing at once, arguing that the defendant had sufficient time to prepare, but was unable or unwilling to secure legal representation for herself. Every word was reasonable. Every argument was correct, on paper. The judge looked toward Grace. His gaze was neither harsh nor gentle. It was the look of someone who had seen too many tragedies to be surprised. "Mrs. Simmons," he said slowly, "if your attorney is not present at this moment, the court must consider you to be self-represented. Given the complexity of the asset records in this case, that is something I do not recommend." Grace tightened her hands even more. She took a deep breath. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly but not breaking. "Please grant me a few more minutes, just a few minutes." Keith let out a soft laugh, this time not bothering to hide it. "A few minutes," he repeated, tilting his head as if thinking. "She's already had a few months, Your Honor." He continued, his voice quiet but clearly audible. "Frankly, I don't think anyone is coming at all." Those words hung in the air like a verdict not yet spoken. Grace felt this moment, the moment when everything could collapse. Not because she was weak, but because this system was not designed to wait for those without power. She stood there between two worlds. On one side, the man who once promised to protect her, now using the law itself to crush her. On the other, a cold system, driven by time and money. She closed her eyes for a very brief second, not to beg, but to remind herself, "I am still standing." Grace opened her eyes. She looked toward the large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, and in that moment, when Keith Simmons was sure that Grace's silence was the end, he had no idea that the silence was merely the pause before the tide turned. The air in the courtroom grew thick, as if someone had just sealed off every possible exit. The low hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt too loud, each cold breath of air brushing across the back of the neck, sending a shiver through anyone who felt it. Time no longer moved evenly. It stretched, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on Grace Simmons' chest like a slab of stone. The judge bent over the file before him. The pen in his hand paused, the tip touching the paper, lifting, then touching down again, repeating the motion several times. It was the sign of a decision about to be made, a decision that would not wait for anyone. "Mrs. Simmons," his voice sounded, slow and clear. "The court has granted you additional time. I understand your situation, but we cannot continue to delay." Grace stood still. Her feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. In that moment, she felt smaller than ever, not because she lacked worth, but because that worth was being measured by a standard she had never chosen. Money, power, and the presence of someone in an expensive suit standing beside her. Keith Simmons leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. The lawyer gave a slight nod. Keith straightened his back, clasped his hands together, his expression as calm as someone about to sign a business contract, not someone watching another person's life being decided. "Your Honor," Keith's lawyer stood up, his tone calm to the point of coldness. With all due respect, we request that the court proceed immediately. The defendant has failed to secure legal representation for herself. Under the rules, we have grounds to request a default judgment regarding the division of assets. The word default rang out, sharp as a slash. It was not just a legal term. It was a declaration that this story could end before Grace had even finished a single sentence. Keith did not miss the opportunity. He rose, adjusted his jacket, his voice low but clearly audible. "Your Honor," he said, "I simply hope this can be resolved efficiently. I have work, I have responsibilities. I cannot sit here all day because of someone else's delays." He paused, glancing toward Grace, his eyes making no effort to hide their contempt. "My wife," Keith continued, "has no income, no personal assets. I supported her for many years. I made a fair, indeed generous offer. But she refused. And now she comes here without a lawyer, without documents, without a plan." A deep breath. Keith concluded lightly, "I don't believe this should be dragged out any longer." Grace felt each word like layers of ice settling against her skin. She wanted to argue, to say that the so-called support came with control, to say that money was not the measure of fairness, to say that she refused because she could not sell herself short. But she knew right now her words would be dismissed as emotional, as weakness, as irrelevant. The judge turned towards Grace. His gaze lingered a moment longer as if weighing law against conscience. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, "the court cannot wait indefinitely. If your attorney does not appear right now, I will be forced to proceed." Grace swallowed. Her throat was dry. She looked around the courtroom, the tall walls, the distant ceiling, the unfamiliar faces. No one stood on her side. No one had any reason to. Except, she told herself, she still had herself. "Your Honor, please," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly but not breaking. "Just 2 more minutes." Keith laughed, this time softly but full of mockery, like a poisonous whisper slipping into everyone's ears. 2 minutes, he repeated. "She's had her entire life to prepare, Your Honor." Keith's lawyer shrugged, as if reluctantly agreeing. "We object to any further delay." The judge exhaled a weary sigh. He picked up the wooden gavel and turned it lightly in his hand. That moment stretched. Long enough for Grace to feel her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Long enough for Keith to be sure that he was about to win. "Mrs. Simmons," the judge said sternly, "the court will—" Wood tapped against wood. Click. A slight sound, but one that could end everything. Grace closed her eyes. In that brief darkness, memories rushed in. Quiet mornings in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the paintings she created when no one was paying attention, the times she stayed silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one was willing to listen. She thought of the years that had passed, not perfect, but they were hers. "I'm not wrong," Grace thought. "I've just come to the wrong place." She opened her eyes, and in that moment, when Keith Simmons was preparing to smile in victory, when the judge's gavel was about to come down like a final period, the large wooden door at the back of the courtroom shook. Not a gentle opening, but a decisive push. The sound rang out, clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Everyone turned around. Keith frowned, irritated by the interruption. His lawyer froze mid-note, pen suspended in the air. The judge halted, the gavel paused above the desk. Light from the hallway poured into the courtroom like an unfamiliar breeze, and within that light, a figure appeared. Back straight, steady, each step striking the floor with an even sound, like a countdown. Grace turned around. Her heart skipped, not from fear, but from a familiar feeling, deep and hard to name. In that moment, Grace understood that whatever was about to happen, she was no longer standing alone. The door at the back of the courtroom did not open politely. It burst open. The sound rang out like a gunshot, crashing against the thick wooden walls and falling onto the marble floor. Everyone turned at once, as if pulled by an invisible string. In that moment, there was no whispering, no rustling of paper. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to stop. Keith Simmons twisted around in his chair, irritation clear on his face. He did not like being interrupted, especially at the exact moment he was certain victory was already his. His lawyer froze mid-note, the pen hovering above the page, the ink not yet forming a line. The judge halted, the wooden gavel suspended in his hand, not yet brought down. Light from the hallway flooded into the courtroom, slicing through the heavy air with a sharp, cold beam. And within that light, a woman stepped inside. She did not hurry. She did not ask permission. She walked as if this room, with all its power, rules, and judgment, had long been accustomed to her presence. The sound of her heels echoed steadily and precisely, each step like a countdown, not fast, not slow, just enough to make it clear that whatever was approaching could not be stopped. The woman wore a perfectly tailored white suit. Not flashy, no logos, yet a single glance was enough to know it was something money alone could not buy. It was the stature of absolute power. Her silver hair was cut neatly, sharply. Her back was straight as steel. And her eyes, those cold blue eyes, swept across the room as if taking inventory. 3 younger individuals followed behind her, each carrying a thick leather briefcase. They said nothing, did not look around, moving in tight formation like satellites escorting a central force. The group stopped in the middle of the central aisle, at the very center of the courtroom. No one spoke. Keith narrowed his eyes. "Who is that?" he whispered to his lawyer, irritation in his voice. "Is that her lawyer?" Keith's lawyer did not answer. He was staring at the woman, his face visibly pale. The pen slipped from his hand and struck the table with a small clack, a sharp sound in the silence. His lips moved as if he were trying to say something, but then stopped. "That's impossible," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Keith turned to him, annoyed. "What did you say?" The woman stopped in front of Grace's table. At that moment, Grace was still standing, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her heart racing wildly. She looked at the woman who had just entered, and in an instant, the world seemed to tilt slightly. There was something deeply familiar in that posture. A feeling long buried suddenly surged back, tightening her throat. The woman did not look at Grace immediately. She turned to Keith Simmons. Their eyes met. Keith opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to ask who she was, or to demand order from the judge. But when the woman's gaze locked onto him, every word dissolved. She smiled, not a friendly smile, not a polite one, but the smile of someone who had seen the ending long before the game began. "Apologies for being late," she said, her voice low, clear, filling the room without the need for a microphone. "I had to take care of a few matters related to your finances, Mr. Simmons." Keith blinked. "What?" The woman tilted her head ever so slightly as if choosing her words. "Actually," she continued, "listing all of your offshore accounts took more time than I expected. You have quite a few places to hide your money." A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. The judge leaned forward. He removed his glasses and stared at the woman, not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect mixed with caution. "Counsel," he said slowly, "please state your name for the record." The woman stepped up to the clerk's desk and placed a gold-embossed business card down. She turned back to face the judge. My name is Catherine Bennett," she said. I formally enter the record as counsel for the defendant. She paused for a beat. And, she added, turning to Grace, this time directly, I am also her mother. Time seemed to freeze. Grace felt all the air drain from her lungs. She stared at the woman before her, her mother, the woman she had not seen in 20 years. The woman had walked away from, overwhelmed by pressure, by difference, by a life that felt too distant from the one she wanted. Mom, Grace whispered. Just one word, yet it took immense courage to say it. Keith shot to his feet. That's impossible, he said, his voice rising with panic. Grace said her mother had died. Catherine Bennett turned to him, her gaze icy. She said I left her life, Catherine replied. She didn't say I was dead. Keith took a step back as if realizing he was standing on thin ice. Catherine pulled out a chair and sat down beside Grace. She placed the heavy leather briefcase on the table and unlocked it. Inside were thick stacks of documents, perfectly organized. We're not hugging right now, Catherine said quietly without looking at Grace. This is work. Grace nodded, tears silently falling. This time she did not wipe them away. She was no longer ashamed of her vulnerability, because for the first time today, perhaps for the first time in years, she was not alone. Catherine lifted her gaze, scanning the room. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but allowing no interruption. If you permit, I believe we have a great deal to clarify, and I am confident that after today, the concept of a default judgment will no longer be applicable to this case. Keith Simmons sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. The smile was gone. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he understood one thing very clearly. The door that had just opened was not there to save Grace. It was there to judge him. Some truths do not need to be shouted. They are self-evident. They only need to be placed in the correct position, under the proper light, and everything around them will collapse on its own. After Catherine Bennett introduced herself, the courtroom was no longer the place Keith Simmons believed he controlled. The atmosphere had changed. It was no longer heavy with waiting, but taut, like a drawn bow before a storm. The eyes that had once drifted past Grace with indifference now turned back, focused, cautious. A name had been spoken, and it carried the weight of an entire world. Grace sat down slowly. She felt her mother's presence beside her, not through affection, but through something far more solid. Catherine Bennett did not need to hold her daughter's hand to reassure her. Simply sitting there, with their backs straight and silent, was enough to say, everything was about to change. The judge cleared his throat, trying to pull the hearing back into order. Ms. Bennett, he said, we are in the middle of a preliminary hearing. The plaintiff has filed a motion for default judgment. I need to know, are you prepared to represent the defendant in this matter? Catherine lifted her head. Her gaze was calm, neither defiant nor retreating. Your Honor, she replied, I am not only prepared. I have been preparing for this long before I walked through that door. Keith shifted slightly in his seat. A chill ran down his spine. This was not the performative confidence of lawyers who enjoyed making an impression. This was the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was holding. First, Catherine continued, I would like to clarify a major misunderstanding that exists in this courtroom. She turned and looked directly at Keith Simmons. You believe my daughter has no lawyer because no one was willing to represent her. That is not true. She has no lawyer because she did not want to call me. Grace lowered her head. A brief silence passed. Catherine did not look at her daughter. She faced forward as if addressing the entire room. Grace left home at 20, she said evenly without reproach. She wanted a quiet life. No power, no boardrooms, no names that make others wary. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the Bennett name. Every word Catherine spoke carried weight, not because of volume, but because the truth behind them had been kept silent for far too long. Keith let out a dry laugh, clinging to what little confidence remained. "Very touching," he said, "but family matters have nothing to do with asset division." Catherine turned to him, her gaze sharper this time. "Oh, they do, Mr. Simmons. Very much so. Because your belief that Grace was alone led you to make your greatest mistake." She opened the leather briefcase in front of her. Inside was not a jumble of loose papers, but carefully categorized, meticulously labeled files, each one a piece of a larger picture Keith had never fully seen. "You told this court that my daughter doesn't understand the law," Catherine continued. "You said she wasn't capable of hiring a lawyer. You said it believing no one could challenge you." She paused and opened one of the files. "So allow me to remind you," Catherine said slowly. "Who drafted the legal framework for coercion clauses and marital agreements in this state?" Keith blinked. "What?" "Me," Catherine replied, "in 1998. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Keith's lawyer dropped his gaze, flipping through his notebook rapidly, searching for something, anything that might help him understand whom he was facing. Catherine placed a copy of a document on the table opposite. "And under that very law," she said, "a prenuptial agreement signed under threat, financial, psychological, or physical, shall be rendered void." Keith sprang to his feet. "That's a lie," he snapped. "She signed it voluntarily." Catherine did not flinch. "Did she?" she asked, her voice so soft it was frightening. "Then perhaps you would like to explain these messages?" She gestured. Another stack of papers was placed on the judge's desk. "Messages from your phone number," Catherine said, "sent to Grace the night before the wedding. In them, you threatened to cut off all financial support for her grandmother, who was in a nursing home if she did not sign." Grace closed her eyes. The memory surged back, sharp and painful. She remembered the icy feeling in her hand as she held the pen, remembered Keith's voice that night, not shouting, not angry, just calm, as if discussing the weather. Keith shook his head wildly. "She made it up." "We have evidence," Catherine continued, without even looking at him. "The messages were recovered from a cloud server you believed you had completely wiped." Keith's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we have not had time to review these materials. This is—" "An ambush?" Catherine cut in, offering a thin smile. "You just asked for a default judgment against a woman without legal counsel, while your client mocked her in this very room. You do not get to complain about fairness." Keith felt the room closing in around him. Everything he believed was secure, contracts, money, power, suddenly felt fragile. And what terrified him most was not the documents. It was Catherine Bennett's calm. She was not angry, not hurried, not trying to prove anything. She was simply opening one by one the drawers Keith had spent years trying to lock shut. Grace opened her eyes. She looked at her mother, the woman she had once run from for being too harsh, too cold. Now that very coldness was forming a solid wall in front of her. In that moment, Grace understood something. She had not been running from her mother for 20 years. She had been running from her own strength. And now, as the truth began to spill into the light, Grace was no longer afraid. Because for the first time, the past was no longer a burden. It had become a weapon. There is a very brief moment in a person's life, so brief that many never realize it, when the balance of power quietly shifts. There is no thunder, no fireworks, just a silent transition. But once it happens, every step that follows can no longer be undone. That moment had arrived for Keith Simmons. Catherine Bennett stood up and smoothed the front of her white suit jacket, her movements unhurried, as though she felt no pressure from the hundreds of eyes fixed on her. She walked toward the lectern and placed both hands on the dark wooden surface. She held no papers. She glanced at no notes. There was only a calm, so composed, it was unsettling. "Your Honor," Catherine began, "we have just discussed what should never exist in a marriage: coercion, threats, and control. Now, with the court's permission, I would like to speak about what did exist, but was deliberately concealed." She turned to Keith, not with a hostile stare, but with the gaze of someone who had already read the entire story and was now preparing to read aloud the pages the author had tried to tear out. "You testified before this court that your net worth is approximately $8 million, Catherine said. That figure sounds reasonable for a mid-level marketing executive who knows how to invest. Keith nodded immediately, clinging to the statement like a lifeline. "That's correct," he said quickly. "Everything is in the financial disclosure." Catherine smiled. "Everything?" she repeated. "I'm afraid not." She gestured. One of the three assistants behind her stepped forward and placed a file in front of the judge, thicker than anything that had appeared since the hearing began. The thud as it hit the table was heavy, deliberate, like a carefully placed period. "This," Catherine said, "is the result of 12 consecutive hours of work by my forensic accounting team." She paused, allowing the courtroom to absorb what had just been said. "They usually trace funding for international terrorism," she continued calmly. "Today, they traced your money." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Keith swallowed hard. His lawyer bent over the file, flipping pages rapidly, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Catherine went on. "Over the past 5 years, you gradually transferred marital assets into a network of shell companies, registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. All of them funnel into a single entity, Apex Ventures." Keith shook his head. "That's my private company," he said urgently. "Perfectly legal." "Possibly," Catherine replied, "but the money inside it is not entirely yours." She stepped down one level, moving slightly closer, not invading, but close enough for Keith to feel the pressure. "After cross-referencing cash flows, bank statements, and tax filings," Catherine said, "we discovered that the amount you concealed is not $8 million. She paused. "It is $24 million. The air seemed to drain from the room. Keith opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lawyer flipped pages faster, as if speed itself might save something. "And," Catherine continued evenly, "you signed your financial affidavit this morning, affirming that no other assets existed beyond those disclosed. That affidavit was signed under oath." She turned to the judge and gave a slight nod. "This constitutes criminal fraud." Keith sprang to his feet. "No!" he shouted. "I didn't hide anything. That money is mine." The judge struck the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Simmons." Keith collapsed back into his chair, his eyes darting around, searching for salvation. "Do something," he whispered to his lawyer. "You have to do something." The lawyer looked up, and for the first time that day, his confidence was gone. He looked at Catherine, then at the judge, then back at Keith. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was standing on a sinking ship. "Please, may we have a 1-hour recess?" the lawyer said, his voice hoarse. "Request denied," the judge replied immediately. "I want to hear the rest." Catherine nodded, as if she had been expecting that answer. "We're not finished," she said, turning back to Keith. "Because beyond the $24 million, there is another amount, smaller, but quite interesting." She withdrew a single sheet of paper. "On March 14th of last year," Catherine said, $2 million was transferred from a bank in Cyprus into an Apex Ventures account. On the same day, that amount was withdrawn and converted into a form of cryptocurrency that is not easily traceable. Keith lowered his head. The market was volatile at the time, he said weakly. It was an investment. An investment, Catherine repeated. And where did you store that investment? Keith said nothing. Allow me to help you, Catherine said, her voice dropping slightly. On a cold storage hard drive, currently held in safety deposit box number 404 at the Chase branch near Grand Central. Keith snapped his head up. How do you know that? Catherine tilted her head. That's my job. This silence was no longer heavy. It was crushing. Keith felt cold sweat run down his spine. Every layer of confidence, every mocking laugh from earlier, dissolved. Standing before him was no longer an isolated woman, but a system, cold, precise, and unforgiving. You used marital funds to buy freedom for yourself, Catherine said slowly, while my daughter had to count every dollar at the grocery store. Keith exploded. That's my money, he screamed. I earned it. She just sat at home painting useless pictures. The room went dead silent. The judge looked at Keith with undisguised disgust. Mr. Simmons, he said, you have just admitted to the existence of concealed assets and to deliberately hiding them from your wife. Do you understand what that means? Keith looked around. His lawyer had lowered his head, both hands gripping it. Catherine turned away. No further questions for this witness, she said decisively. Grace sat motionless. Tears streamed down her face, but no longer from fear. It was the feeling of someone who had just watched the prison walls that had confined her for so long collapse. Keith Simmons once believed he was the hunter, but he had forgotten one thing. The most dangerous predators never need to growl. There are moments in life when the truth no longer requires proof by numbers or paperwork. It only takes one person stepping forward, opening their mouth to speak what has been hidden, and every layer of disguise falls away at once. After Keith Simmons stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom did not soften. On the contrary, it became frighteningly still. This was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of realization, when everyone understood that the worst might not yet be over. Keith collapsed into his chair, his shoulders sagging as if he were carrying the weight of the entire room on his back. The arrogant gaze he had worn throughout the morning was gone entirely. In its place was a hollow, unsteady look, clinging desperately to whatever scraps remained, an exit, a miracle, some intervention from the very system he once believed he controlled. Keith's lawyer sat a short distance away, far enough not to be dragged down with him, close enough to fulfill his final obligation. He was no longer writing, no longer flipping through files. He simply sat there, waiting for the storm to pass, hoping he would not be swept away with it. Catherine Bennett stood up once more. This time she carried no thick file, no documents, no charts, no numbers, just a measured step toward the lectern and a single sentence that made Keith feel his chest tighten. Your Honor, Catherine said calmly, to fully understand the extent of the harm in this case, I request permission to call a witness. She paused for a beat, letting the entire room sink into anticipation. I call Sasha Miller. Keith froze. The name did not strike like thunder. It landed like a clean, precise, and merciless cut. Keith snapped his head up, eyes wide, lips moving, but no words came out. No, he whispered. She won't come. The door at the back of the courtroom opened again, this time without drama, without force. Just a slow, cautious movement. And a young woman stepped inside. Sasha Miller. She wore a dark blue dress, modest, unadorned. Her beauty was not in glamour, but in fragility. Her shoulders were slightly drawn inward, her steps were hesitant, and her eyes avoided contact. She did not look at Keith as she passed him. She did not even glance his way, as if he had become something too toxic to touch with her gaze. Keith reached out instinctively. "Sasha," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Don't." She paused for a fraction of a second, then pulled away from his touch as if avoiding a hot shard of glass. No words, no look. That moment, brief as it was, said everything. Sasha stepped onto the witness stand. She was sworn in. Her hand trembled slightly as it rested on the book, but her voice, when she answered, was more unmistakable than Keith had expected. Catherine approached, not crowding her, keeping just enough distance to avoid pressure. "Thank you for coming, Sasha," she said, her voice lower and gentler than before. "I know this isn't easy." Sasha nodded and took a deep breath. "Can you tell the court your relationship with Mr. Simmons?" Catherine asked. Sasha swallowed. I was his girlfriend for 2 years. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Keith lowered his head, his hands clenched into fists. "His girlfriend," Catherine repeated lightly. "And what about now?" Sasha inhaled again, as if gathering every remaining ounce of courage. "I ended that relationship this morning." Keith looked up. "You can't," he began, then fell silent when the judge looked his way. "Why did you end the relationship?" Catherine asked, her tone steady, unpressured. Sasha turned and looked at Keith for the first time since entering the courtroom. There was no love in her eyes, no fear, only disillusionment. "Because I knew I wasn't the only one," she said. "And because I knew what kind of man he really is." The courtroom held its breath. Catherine nodded, allowing her to continue. "Did Mr. Simmons ever talk to you about his wife, Grace?" she asked. Sasha let out a bitter laugh. "Very often," she replied. "Almost all the time." Grace sat motionless. Catherine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, a light touch, but enough to keep her steady. "What did he say?" Catherine asked. Sasha glanced toward Grace, a flicker of guilt passing through her eyes. "He said she was a burden, an obstacle, someone ungrateful." Each word fell as a pebble dropped into still water. "He said," Sasha continued, her voice beginning to shake, "that he would destroy her in court, that he had hired a killer lawyer, that Grace was too stupid to fight back." Keith shook his head furiously. "She's lying," he shouted. The judge struck the gavel. "Silence, Mr. Simmons." Sasha did not stop. As if a door had been opened and everything long kept inside now poured out. "He bragged that he would leave her homeless," Sasha said, tears beginning to fall. "He said he would leave her with nothing, force her to come back and beg him. He said he wanted to own her." The room went dead silent. Grace bent forward, covering her face with both hands. Her sobs were not loud, but they rang clearer than any accusation. Catherine let the silence stretch. She understood. Some words must be heard in full, uninterrupted. "Thank you, Sasha," Catherine said softly when the young woman stopped. "No further questions." She turned to Keith's lawyer. "Would you like to cross-examine?" The lawyer stood, then sat back down. He looked at Keith, then at the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said dryly. "No questions." Sasha left the witness stand, walking past Keith without turning back. Keith watched her go, his eyes empty, as if the final piece of the armor he had built over the years had just fallen away. The judge removed his glasses, wiped them slowly, then looked straight at Keith Simmons. "In my 20 years on the bench," he said, his voice low and heavy, "I have seen many forms of disgraceful behavior. But rarely have I seen cruelty displayed so proudly. Keith lowered his head. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to hide. And in that moment, Keith Simmons understood a truth far too late. Money can buy lawyers. Power can silence victims. But once the truth finds its voice, there is nowhere left to hide. There are moments when justice does not need to be angry. It only needs to stand upright, look straight ahead, and speak the truth that cannot be denied. After Sasha Miller's testimony, the courtroom sank into a different kind of silence than before. It was no longer the tense silence of waiting, nor the timid silence of the powerless. This was the silence of conclusion, when everyone understood that the picture was complete and no missing piece could undo what had been exposed. Keith Simmons sat motionless. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly, as if his body were trying to hold on to something his mind had long since lost. Control. His gaze no longer darted around searching for an escape. It was fixed on the wooden table before him, where the old scratches suddenly appeared more evident than ever, like marks of time, of truths that could not be erased. Keith's lawyer stood up, then sat back down. He cleared his throat but said nothing. There were no arguments left. No rebuttals. Every strategy carefully prepared had become meaningless in the face of the testimony just heard. There are moments when one understands that continuing to speak only makes things worse. The judge straightened in his chair. He removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk, then looked around the room, unhurried, unafraid. His gaze rested on Grace, then on Catherine, and finally on Keith Simmons. "Mr. Simmons," he said, his voice low and slow, "is there anything you wish to say before the court issues a temporary ruling?" Keith lifted his head. His lips moved. For a very brief moment, it seemed he was about to say something, a justification, a plea, perhaps even an apology. But then, as if realizing there were no words left with enough weight, he lowered his head again. There was no answer. The judge gave a slight nod as though he had expected it. He picked up his pen but did not write immediately. Instead, he spoke, not like someone reading a verdict, but like someone correcting a mistake that had gone on for far too long. "Over many years on the bench," he said, "I have witnessed countless cases where power was used to silence those weaker. But rarely have I seen it wielded as brazenly as in this case." He paused, looking directly at Keith. "You entered this courtroom with contempt toward your wife, toward the legal process, and toward the very concept of fairness. You believed that money and preparation would allow you to decide the outcome before the court ever spoke." The judge turned to Grace. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his tone softening slightly, "this court owes you an apology. This system should have protected you much earlier." Grace took a deep breath. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not lower her head. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she stood upright, not because of victory, but because of being acknowledged. Catherine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, saying nothing. There was no need. The judge turned back to the desk and picked up his pen. This time, he wrote, "Based on the evidence and testimony presented," he said, "the court issues a temporary ruling effective immediately." The room held its breath. "First," the judge continued, "all assets held in the name of Mr. Keith Simmons, as well as any related entities, including Apex Ventures and any shell companies, are hereby fully frozen." Keith snapped his head up. "Access to those assets," the judge added, "is temporarily granted to Mrs. Grace Simmons and her legal counsel." A collective exhale came from the gallery. Not joy, but relief, as if, at last, something right had been spoken aloud. Second, the judge went on, Mrs. Simmons is granted exclusive use and residency of all marital property, including the apartment on Fifth Avenue and the property in the Hamptons. He looked directly at Keith. Mr. Simmons, you have 2 hours to vacate the aforementioned properties. You may take only basic personal belongings. Any attempt to move, remove, or otherwise interfere with the property will be considered contempt of court. Keith opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Third, the judge said, his voice firm, the court refers the full transcript of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges, including perjury, financial fraud, and deception. Keith's lawyer lowered his head even further. He understood. The game was over. Finally, the judge said, turning to Catherine, regarding legal fees. Catherine smiled very faintly, not a smile of triumph, but the smile of someone who had completed a necessary task. Mr. Simmons, the judge said, will bear full responsibility for Mrs. Simmons's legal costs. Keith let out a low groan, a short, broken sound. This hearing is adjourned, the judge concluded, striking the gavel. The court will reconvene following the completion of a comprehensive forensic audit. The sound of the gavel echoed, clear, decisive, not like the end of a story, but like the end of an illusion. People began to stand, gather their papers, and whisper to one another. But Keith Simmons remained seated, motionless, as if by not moving time might reverse and everything would return to the moment when he had still been laughing at his wife. Grace stood up. She felt the floor beneath her feet, solid, honest, no longer unsteady as before. She gathered her few small belongings, then turned back to look at Keith. There was no anger, no satisfaction, only a quiet ending. Keith looked up, his voice hoarse. Grace, you can't do this. Where am I supposed to go? Grace looked at him for a long moment, then she gently shook her head. Before she could say anything, Catherine stepped forward, placing herself between them. No need to be taller, no need to raise her voice, just standing there like a wall that could not be crossed. My daughter, Catherine said, her voice cold and clear, does not speak to those who chose their own path. She turned to Grace, her tone softening. Let's go. Grace nodded. As mother and daughter walked out of the courtroom, the hallway light fell on them. Not bright, not dramatic, just the light of an ordinary afternoon. But for Grace, it was the light of a life that had just been returned to her. The stone steps in front of the courthouse were still warm from the late afternoon sun. The city murmured behind them like a familiar soundtrack, the hum of traffic, people calling out to one another, wind slipping between rows of tall buildings. Grace stepped outside and took a deep breath, feeling the air of freedom fill her lungs. Everything seemed finished. At least, in that moment, she believed it was. Catherine walked beside her daughter, her posture straight and steady, as if nothing in the world could make her falter. She did not smile, but her expression had softened. The work was done. The hardest part was over. We'll have lunch, Catherine said calmly. You need to eat properly. Then, get some sleep. Grace nodded. She felt lighter, as if she had just taken off a heavy coat she'd been wearing for years. But just as she prepared to take another step down the stairs, a black sedan glided up and stopped at the curb. The movement was clean, decisive, unhurried. The rear window rolled down slowly. Grace stopped. Inside the window was a face painfully familiar. Neatly trimmed silver hair, features hard as if carved from stone. Those eyes, she had seen them many years ago, held no familial warmth, only the cold precision of numbers carefully weighed. Grace, the man said, his voice low and even. It's been a long time. Grace's throat went dry. Dad, she said, almost in a whisper. Catherine halted, Her hands tightened around the leather briefcase, knuckles standing out sharply. She turned to face the man in the car, William, the man whose shared past with her was longer and heavier than any legal battle. "What are you doing here?" Catherine asked, her tone sharp without greeting. William opened the car door and stepped out. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, keeping a distance that was not intrusive, yet close enough for pressure to radiate. "I'm here because of a debt," he said. "And because I heard the two of you just took everything from Keith Simmons." Grace felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet. "What are you talking about?" she asked. William looked straight at Grace. His eyes were neither hostile nor gentle. "Keith borrowed $2 million from my company," he said, 6 months ago. "He used the Fifth Avenue apartment as collateral." A beat of silence fell. Grace turned to Catherine. "Mom?" Catherine did not answer immediately. She stepped forward and took the documents William handed her. She read quickly, very quickly, her eyes moving down the lines, sharp as a blade. The city around them seemed to fade, giving way to a moment of confrontation between three people bound by past and money. "If Keith defaults," William continued, "the property belongs to me. And given the ruling that just came down, I'm afraid that will happen very soon." Grace felt her heart tighten. She had just reclaimed her home, the place that held her memories, where she believed she could begin again. And now it was slipping away, this time because of her own father. "You can't do that," Grace said, her voice trembling. "That's my home." William exhaled. "It's business, Grace. I have investors. I can't afford to lose $2 million. Catherine looked up, her gaze turning cold. "You knew Keith was hiding assets," she said. "And you still lent him the money?" William shrugged slightly. "I didn't know he was hiding them from you," he replied. "I only knew he needed cash, and that he had assets." "You've always been good at not knowing what you don't want to know," Catherine said, her voice low but cutting. William frowned. "Kate, this isn't the time to—" "Oh, it is," Catherine cut in, a faint smile touching her lips. "This is exactly the time." She lowered her gaze to the documents and pointed to a section. "This clause," she said. "Section 4, subsection B. The borrower affirms that he holds independent and unencumbered ownership of the collateral." William nodded. "Yes, Keith's name is on the deed." "On the copy you received," Catherine corrected. "Not in the county records." William froze. Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out a blue file. "In 2018, she said, Keith agreed to transfer the apartment into a family trust with Grace as the beneficiary. The purpose was to reduce tax liability. He signed, but he didn't read the bylaws carefully." Grace held her breath. "The bylaws stipulate," Catherine continued, "that any use of the property as collateral requires the signatures of all beneficiaries." She looked directly at William. "Grace didn't sign." William bent over the contract in his hands. On the second signature line was a shaky, distorted scrawl, similar to Grace's name, but not hers. "He forged it," Grace whispered. A wave of betrayal washed over her, icy and sharp. Catherine nodded. "Yes." William tightened his grip on the paper, his face turning gray. "If the signature was forged," he said slowly, "then the contract is void." "Exactly," Catherine replied, her tone as calm as if explaining a simple equation. "Which means you're holding a $2 million debt with no collateral." William swore softly and turned away a step. "He conned me." "Not just you," Catherine said. "He conned everyone." William turned back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "So, what do I do now?" Catherine stepped forward, not forcing, not threatening. "Go after Keith," she said. "Garnish his income. Take the watch, the car, whatever's left. But the apartment, leave it for Grace." William was silent for a long time. The city continued its noise as if utterly indifferent to the quiet negotiation unfolding on the sidewalk. Finally, he sighed. "Grace," he said hoarsely. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done business with him." Grace looked at the man before her, the man who had once put interests above family, the man who had driven her away. This time she felt no anger, only fatigue. "I'm okay," Grace said. "You can go now." William nodded and returned to the car. The door closed. The sedan pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic, disappearing into the city. Grace stood still for a long moment. Then she turned to Catherine. "Mom," she said softly, "I thought everything was over." Catherine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. This time, the touch was warmer. "Victory rarely comes neatly," she said. "But you stood your ground, and that's enough." Grace took a deep breath. The darkness had retreated, not vanished completely, but it had been named and pushed back. She looked up at the strip of sky between the tall buildings. The light was still there, and this time she knew, no matter how many times the past returned to collect its debts, she would no longer face it alone. 3 months passed quietly, without fanfare, without applause. Time did not arrive to soothe with comforting words. It came with the steady rhythm of ordinary days, where one learns how to breathe again, stand upright again, and say one's own name without trembling. On an early autumn evening, the Chelsea district was illuminated by its large glass windows. Light spilt from the gallery onto white walls where paintings hung neatly, each frame holding a life that had just been stitched back together with color. The small text on the exhibition placard read, "Rebirth." Grace stood in the middle of the room wearing a perfectly fitted red dress. Not glamorous, not showy, just right for her. In her hand was not a glass of champagne, but sparkling water, cold and clear. She smiled, spoke with art lovers, and listened as they debated tones, brushstrokes, and the feeling of standing before a painting that made their chests feel heavy. At the center of the room, the largest painting drew every eye. Title: The Gavel. No specific faces, only a shape of light breaking through dark chains. The light was not blinding, it was persistent. It did not tear apart, it separated, layer by layer. People stood before the painting, each seeing a different story, but all felt one thing in common: a quiet liberation. "Sold," a collector said, barely needing to ask the price. "Everything's sold," the gallery manager whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Grace blinked. For a very brief moment, memories rushed back. The gray dress, the empty chair, the cold courtroom. Then the memories receded, making room for the present. She smiled. Not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had come home. In the corner of the room, Catherine Bennett observed. The martini in her hand was barely touched. She didn't need to stand close to be noticed. Her presence created its own space. But her eyes, this time, were not sharp. They softened, ever so slightly, as she watched her daughter smile among her own paintings. Catherine's phone vibrated gently. A notification appeared. She glanced at it, then tapped it open. The headline was short, cold, and factual. Keith Simmons was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement. The attached photo showed a man with hollow eyes, greasy hair, and hands in cuffs. No expensive suit, no vintage watch, no mocking smile. Catherine turned off the screen and slipped the phone into her pocket. She didn't need to read more. She had been in the front row on sentencing day. Some chapters don't need to be reopened to be remembered. Grace approached. "Mom," she said softly but firmly, "I thank you." Catherine shook her head slightly. "You got here on your own," she replied. "I just stood in the right place when you needed it." A young assistant, Toby, hurried over, still breathless with excitement. He handed Grace a tablet. On the screen was a newly updated account. Balance, the result of liquidating remaining assets combined with compensation for emotional harm and financial abuse. Grace looked at the number. Then she looked up. "It's over," she said, as if to herself. "It's really over." Catherine lightly tapped her glass against Grace's. "No," she said, her voice warmer than usual. "It's just beginning." Outside, the city continued to live, loud, hurried, waiting for no one. But in this room, time seemed to slow by a single beat, just long enough for people to realize that what had changed was not money or fame. It was the way a person stood before their own life. Grace moved among the guests, listening, thanking, responding. No question unsettled her. No gaze made her shrink. The paintings, her creations, spoke the words she once could not. Somewhere else, far away, Keith Simmons sat in a cold prison cell. 4 walls without laughter. No leather chair. No one to mock. Only time, the thing he once believed he could buy, now arriving slowly, undeniably. He realized too late one thing. Grace's silence had never been weakness. It was the pause before the truth was chambered. Some say this story is about money. Others say it is about the law. But deeper than all of that, it is a story about voice and the price of trying to take someone else's away. Grace stood once more before the gavel as the gallery began to thin. Light reflected in her eyes. No fear, no asking for permission. Only the calm of someone who had made it through a long night. She thought of a line, not to hang on a wall, but to keep in her heart. Silence is not weakness. It is only the pause before the truth speaks. Catherine stepped up and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. This time the touch lingered. "Let's go home," she said. "You paint again tomorrow." Grace nodded. She looked back at the room, not to cling to it, but to remember. Then she turned and stepped into the street, where the cool night air still shone brightly. Some stories do not end with applause. They end with a person standing a little taller than yesterday. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs a spark of light and commenting on your thoughts. We read every word. Don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales so you won't miss more profound life stories where silence doesn't disappear, but becomes strength. Be careful when you mock someone. You never know who will walk through the next door. See you in the following story.